We've written the book Controlling the Human Mind, and we wrote and produced the video Mind Control, which Alex has carried for years. And I always consider that the most important work. Even when you associate some of the mind effects things with HAARP, they're big and they're important. But as we got more into that subject, it became, for me, the most compelling and important work that we've published. Because the idea of interfering with human consciousness, this idea of being able to interfere with free will, if you will, something that even God will not do in most religious traditions, interfere with free will, is now within the capability of man. Should man do it? I say absolutely not. Again, thinking about personal liberty and personal freedom, the basic premise of the First Amendment of the Constitution, the right of free speech, the right of assembly, the right of free expression of religion, all of those presuppose a fundamental right, the freedom to think. That's the First Amendment, because it presupposes all of that. Without the freedom to think, none of the other liberties matter at all. And this is the century that we're in. The CIA, actually the work in this goes before the CIA. You go back to the work at Harvard, work being done at the hypnotherapy labs at Harvard in the 1920s by a guy named Estabrook. And Estabrook had this idea that you could create what we would call today the Manchurian candidate, you know, some super spy that would be pre-programmed to do destruction or gather intelligence, and if captured would have absolutely no knowledge of any of it. Well, he started this work in the 20s. By the 1930s, his work was classified. By the 1960s, the material he had published, he acknowledged that he created these super spies, that he spent 9 to 10 months, and 1 out of 5 people were subject to this level of programming, where he would subject them to 9 to 10 months of programming where he literally split the personality into 2 separate human beings within the same body, programming one to be the super spy where they could function in another country without detection, and if captured would have no memory of their true self. And yet when they returned to the United States, this altered consciousness could be re-triggered to remember everything they collected in the foreign country and their true self. The problem is you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Once you fracture a human being in this way, you've effectively destroyed them forever. He believed this was a good idea, and he advanced this technology. And the same material that he published advancing the idea that using LSD to alter people's consciousness for mind control experiments was legitimized and reasonable and a good thing. That's what he wrote in his published work. At the same time, the Central Intelligence Agency later was revealed to be experimenting with LSD on 8,000 men and women in the armed services alone, not to mention the civilian sector. This came out in a congressional report that was on activities within the CIA right after Watergate. When, remember Watergate, you know, there's ex-CIA operatives breaking into this building for the bagmen of the Nixon administration. Well, there are no ex-CIA guys, number one, unless they're dead. And number two, the fact is when they got caught, what they got caught doing were mind control experiments. The church committees and the Congress actually heard the testimony as the CIA busied themselves shredding the documents, because they acknowledged over 140 programs under MK Ultra and its sub-programs that were directly involved in the manipulation of human behavior using chemical means and electromagnetic means. And one of the organizations they worked through at the time was the Mankind Research Association, operated out of Bethesda, Maryland, which was a front for Navy intelligence organizations and the Central Intelligence Organization developing mind control technologies and an understanding of what those would be about. More than a Manchurian candidate, manipulating people over huge geographic areas for very specific outcomes. At the same time, they were engaged in a great deal of research on what they called paraphysics, or parapsychology, or ESP in those days. A number of those reports prepared as far as our analysis of Eastern Europe that were eventually released under Freedom of Information Act are posted on our website. And you can go and look there, and you'll see hundreds of pages of these declassified documents. They're heavily redacted. I mean, lots blacked out, but you get a general sense of what we were doing. And here's what they discovered. And it's not in the published work. It's not in the other videos. It's not in that material. But here's the conclusions after all of it. And I met the Northwest field director, got to know him real well over the years, of the Mankind Research Association, the kind of stuff they were doing back in the 70s. And he kept his data. He's got a great box of data talking about all of these experimentations. And what they concluded was that A, extrasensory perceptions, these odd little things that people could do, were real. Not in all instances, but in enough instances to cause them some alarm, military planners. Because what also they discovered is that human beings generally have these innate capabilities that we used to call extrasensory perception. Some have referred to as gifts of the spirit. They come by a lot of different names. But what they are is natural attributes of what human beings are. We're created in the image of a creator. That means more than how we look. It has to do with what we are. And what we are very capable individuals. But in order to reach those higher capabilities, in order to reach those higher states of awareness, in order to actualize your full potential as a human being, you have to be able to slow the mind. You have to be able to create a situation where the mind, if you were to look at it with an EEG and look at the brain activity, you get very coherent, very rhythmic patterns, the kind associated with the emotions of love and empathy and compassion. Same kind of patterns show up. Higher ordered thinking is associated with these coherent patterns, these rhythmic patterns. Fear, flight responses, anger, hate, you get incoherent patterns all over the map at a higher amplitude, at a higher pulse rate that indicate agitation, confusion, the inability to think. What we do know is that in states of fear, worry, and anxiety, you cannot ever reach your higher capacity as a human being. So the easiest mind control technique, keep people in a state of fear and worry and agitation, and we're defeated before the first volley is fired. That's not what we need to be about. You know, when you think about it, when you're walking confidently, consciously doing what you know you're capable of doing, how empowering it is to step into each act that you take on as a human being in a productive and meaningful way, without fear, without worry. It's when your mind falls into what some call that zone that the athlete knows and the artist knows and every one of us knows in those instances where those sparks of creativity come through. That is our normal state of consciousness. If you were to look at it in the lower range of the alpha range where you are in that most creative mindset, you'd be between 7 and 8, 7 and 9 hertz pulses per second. The planet naturally oscillates at 7.83 hertz pulses per second. Isn't that interesting? Correlates perfectly with the ideal state for awake, conscious living when you're awake. And yet the fields that we surround ourselves with in this room right now, in every room where everyone's watching this because the power grid is operating at 60 hertz, 60 pulses per second, an agitating signal all the time in our background noise, if you will, our noise. Because think about it, in a crowded room, all the noise you hear and you're having a conversation with your friend, and you block out all that background noise. We do the same thing with electromagnetic fields. I'll tell you when you notice it. I couldn't use this analogy in Germany. I'll tell you why in a minute. But think about when the power fails in your community. When the power goes out, completely goes out, the power grid's down. Now everybody remembers it given all the winter storm activity. And the first thing you notice how quiet it is because the refrigerator's not humming along, the air conditioner or the heaters aren't blowing air around. The second thing you notice is how your whole body exhales as you relax. Same feeling when you come in from a hard day of work and you're wearing your insulated soles on your shoes, and the first thing you do is you kick them off and you come back into ground with the pulse rate of the planet and you relax. That relaxation is the silence. Do you know what the sound of being born into an explosion is? Silence. We're living in that explosion, in the fields that surround us every moment of every day. When I used that analogy this last year in Stuttgart, everybody looked at me like I was crazy when I said, you know, when the power fails. It never fails in Germany. People with gray hair never remember a power failure since World War II ended. You know, I mean, we don't even think about that. I mean, you talk about the contrast in technology. I can't even use the same analogy in Europe because it doesn't make sense. Because their technology happens to run smoother. And we invented the power grid for all practical purposes. But again, you know, I say it humorously, but at the same time recognizing under all this are these very real effects that we have to recognize. So how do you learn how to control you? You know, people ask me all the time, you know, you talk about a lot of technologies generate a lot of concern, some levels of anxiety. That's not my intention. My intention is to inform so we can begin to think about this stuff in a productive, constructive way and how we address it. But more importantly, the more important part of this message, and anything that I've said in the last couple of days, is about the fact that we are more than we think we are. There are no small things. There's only things that are undone. Each thing that we do as individuals matters. It matters a lot, more than you might even realize or recognize. And there are no small things. And what I do versus what you do, it's not a size issue. It's getting the work done. All of us have a sphere of influence, and we need to assert ourselves in that sphere of influence. What that means is it might mean that we have a conversation with our family or our close friends. We don't feel any anxiety having done that. When the anxiety creeps in, back off. Think about what you're doing. It should be like breathing if you're working outside of fear and outside of worry, and you're working in a way that is possible, where you acknowledge it's possible. Do what you know you can do to further your version and your view of the truth. And do it in a respectful way. And do it with confidence. And don't lift the burden if it's too heavy. There's someone else that'll lift it for you. Or lift it with you. But do something in favor of what you believe to be right and true. Whether it's on any of the issues we've covered today or on some other issue. But something that you care about and recognize there's a billion other people doing the same thing. And we're not waiting for an organization to form. We're already standing in it. It's called the human race. Participate in it. Be what you were created to be. And assert yourself in the world today by affecting change, by direct action, in a respectful and rational way, and without fear and without worry, because that is the zone in which things can happen. Fear is the adversary. It has always been the adversary, and it's the easiest method of controlling human behavior. When you think of the whole 1984 scenarios, which I think are here now, I mean certainly are here now on steroids. I mean those guys are rolling over in their grave because it's a lot worse than they thought. Huxley, you know, he wrote Brave New World, and the essay most people missed of his was one of the very last ones he wrote, which was Brave New World Revisited. When he went back and sort of looked at it and said, oh no, it's 40 years ahead of where I thought it was. Now this is in the late 1950s, and I think he died in 62 or 63. So the very end of his life, and the things that are the most important to read aren't what somebody wrote early in their career, it's what they wrote at the end, sort of how they evaluate. You know, when I look at studying someone's work, I start with the last thing they wrote and work my way backwards, because there's the pinnacle of their knowledge. And Huxley's pinnacle of the knowledge was the last warning, the last shout in the movie theater saying, hey, it's 40 years ahead of the game, and it probably isn't going to be chemistry that does it. It's going to be something else. And it's the electronics of this century. It's the tools that we've been talking about misapplied to the population. Those are the things that are causing Huxley today to roll over in his grave, because even that warning was 40 years too old. I mean, that warning in the late 50s and his conclusion then was nothing compared to what has emerged in the 21st century and what came out of the last century. This technology to change not just our emotional states, but the way we perceive the world, already exists on the planet. New breakthroughs are being anticipated by military planners. This last year, 2010, DARPA let 2 contracts, University of California, for developing methods and means for creating electronic telepathy, where we can electronically transfer thoughts into the mind of another person in a way that they cannot distinguish the artificial from their own. Now think about that in the 21st century. If you can create a complete memory set, one of the stated goals of Air Force planners, to complete a complete memory set that you cannot distinguish the real from the fiction, is that the witness you want on your trial in the courts of the 21st century? The guy who can swear by that memory, and yet that memory is as false as a $3 bill. That's the technology of this century. It'll challenge the very institutions that we depend on for justice, for liberty, for freedom. Synthetic memory. It's being even played off in terms of Gulf War syndrome and in terms of the shock that people come out of the war with. You know, the shock, the fear, the memories, the post-traumatic stress syndrome that boils out of these war efforts. And so what are we hearing about? Ways to wipe the memory clean so people can forget all those bad experiences. Do they really go away, or do they just get driven deeper into the subconscious where they do their real work at breaking down the consciousness of a human being, where they can't get played out, they can't get worked out, they get suppressed, and suppressed conflicting ideas are the root to a lot of the psychosis we see in the world today. This is the solution of military planners. Wipe out the memory of the gladiator so they don't know what they did. And somehow that will excuse the behavior and save that person's soul. No, it won't. It'll mask the pain and let it break out in some weird, irrational way, because that's what happens when you suppress these kinds of memories. Secondly, maybe we want these guys to remember what they did because maybe some of the things that they were directed to do they shouldn't have done in the first place. Maybe the memories that they have of the abuses that we inflict on others are memories that somebody ought to be testifying to someday, instead of bearing, because now we have a technology that can mask the behavior of our troops in combat. That's not the answer. In the past wars, the wars that our fathers fought and our grandfathers fought, when they returned from battle, the stench of death was still in their noses, and they worked hard to avoid wars in future wars, to save the next generation from experiencing the same trauma they did. Trauma is the outcome of war, but it also makes us, as human beings, resist war, make it our last effort, not our first effort. If we take it out, we make it neutral, where there's no pain, there's no residual memory, it becomes easier and easier to inflict war on others. It becomes easier and easier to use that as the solution rather than diplomacy and fair play. Is that what we want? Is that the reflection of American values we want our military, paranoid closet planners to engage in for us? Or do we want them to uphold the values, instill those values on the next generation of military planners, so that American values are what's projected to the world by our example, not by our hidden agenda? People have asked me, about my father. He was lost on a plane with Hale Boggs in the early 70s. Hale was a majority leader at the time. I mean, you can look at all of the interesting coincidences. The guy that took Hale Boggs to the airport, he was working in Texas at the time for another campaign, and Boggs got a ride to the airport by a young Democrat from Oklahoma, William Jefferson Clinton. Yeah, the same one that later became president. Now, this is 1972. Now, Boggs gets on the plane, he goes to D.C., makes a connection to Alaska, comes to Alaska, gives a speech, breaks the story a little bit about what was coming. We didn't know, it wasn't known as Watergate then, it was just this big scandal that he mentioned. And the next day he gets on a plane flying to Juneau from Anchorage and disappears and never heard from again with my father. Now, Boggs was on the Warren Commission. He wanted the Warren Commission reopened. It was saying so around that time. 6 months before, he had called for the resignation of Hoover. who he believed absolutely corrupt. Because of his own perversions, Hoover's, he used knowledge to blackmail the Congress. He had the inside track on every congressman because he had tapped their phones, intercepted their mail, basically violated all their personal privacy rights. And this was the leadership of the country, for goodness sakes. This is our entire Congress that he corrupted so that he could maintain his position in the FBI. Boggs wanted him out. Boggs came to Alaska. By then, Hoover was gone, but the plane disappears, the Hoover administration continues, the Warren Commission never reopens, and Watergate breaks 3 weeks later. October 16th, 1972, the plane goes down. You know, McGovern's in his last throes of his death race because he isn't winning anything. Richard Nixon's the clear winner. Everybody knows it. Hale Boggs is a majority leader of the House, standing in line to be the next speaker, the third most powerful position in the Congress. And what happens? He disappears at the most critical time in our history. In fact, if you remember, what happened right after Watergate broke and then Agnew got bounced, you know, as the vice president? Ford slid in behind him. Nixon resigns, Ford moves up, Ford pardons Nixon, and Rockefeller rolls in as the vice president. And then if you remember, it was, I think it was Squeaky Fromm, wasn't it Squeaky Fromm? It was one of the Manson girls that takes a pot shot at Ford to knock him off because she wanted him dead, and who would have been president? Rockefeller. Now isn't that interesting? You know, I mean, talk about conspiracy theory. How about conspiracy reality? That's how it played out. Everybody's forgotten it. You know, if you're not 50, you don't remember. You know, but a lot of us remember when all this happened and it played out. Now Boggs is off the scene. Carl Elbert is the speaker. Carl was an alcoholic. I mean, he's come to my house all the time, talked to my dad. The guy could barely sit on a bar stool, and he was Speaker of the House. You know, those were the days when you got stopped by the police for drunk driving, and they said, hey, drive on home and sleep it off. You know, it was a different world in a different era. But Carl Elbert was not in a position at that time to step into the President of the United States. What I think would have happened had Boggs lived, Carl Elbert would have stepped down, Boggs would have stepped up, they would have got rid of Agnew and Nixon at the same time, and the third in line to be president would have been, and that would have been Hale Boggs, and the whole game would have changed in this country. And personal freedom and liberty would have been restored then, instead of going into disrepair even further now. Now, Dad brought Boggs to Alaska to campaign. Dad had that campaign in the bag. He brought him here to show him, to talk about the same issues, many of the same issues that we've talked about over this video. The idea that Alaska has this tremendous potential for the United States that ought to be realized. This was right before the native land claims, the biggest settlement in indigenous history in the United States. As a freshman congressman, my dad got passed a 44 million acre land transfer to indigenous people intact with mineral rights, oil and gas rights, energy rights, timber, surface estate, water rights, everything intact. And they moved that over along with just under $1 billion in 1971, the first year he was a member of Congress as a freshman. Now people say freshmen can't get anything done. I know personally they're wrong. My brother Mark is a freshman senator, 2 years in the job. He's the 5th ranking Democrat in the U.S. Senate and the only member of the U.S. Senate without a college degree. He did it in 2 years because he knows how to work hard, stand for something, and do something. Now, Mark and I don't agree on everything, as brothers never do, but I can tell you this. He's as committed to public service as I am. We have a different way of expressing it. But his risk at getting something done is as great or greater as they've ever been. You know, when you think about congressional deaths, you know, you think about my dad's, what happened is they found out in 1993 through FOIA requests that the military actually knew that my father or somebody at that crash site was alive. 2 people were alive, according to the FBI records that eventually got released. 2 people were alive at a crash site that has never been found. Crash site's never been publicly identified, nor has the people who were alive at that site. Lost in the shuffle of bureaucracy. The documents we saw, that roll call, prestigious publication in D.C., got under a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, all the key names were redacted. When we went after the data from the military, the Air Force overflights, the data that was developed for the biggest air and sea search in the history of the world, and all the records they told us were destroyed. A few months later, because we raised a lot of heck over that, a few months later, mysteriously on my brother's doorstep, a pile of boxes with all those original documents, not redated. Gee, they hadn't been destroyed at all. We've been lied to again. I want to tell you, as the son of a United States congressman, that if it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. That's why we need to get into this fight and engage our government. It shouldn't happen to anyone that our risk to our personal freedom, to our life, should be at risk as people give up their private life in order to carry on everyone else's. In the case of Wellstone, many remember his plane crash in Eveleth, Minnesota. You know, it just happened to be the same town my dad was born in. My uncle was a mayor there, was a state legislature there. Coincidence? Kind of interesting. Do you remember Carnahan, the senator before him that died in Missouri? That was the anniversary date of my dad's disappearance, October 16th. You know, is it coincidence? Maybe so, but it certainly begs the question, you know. I mean, how many people die in plane crashes? My brother beats Ted Stevens in an election. Ted Stevens dies in a plane crash a couple years later. What people don't remember is he was already in a plane crash before where his first wife was killed. Died in a plane crash. People forget about it. Mike Gravel's wife died in a plane crash. People forget about it. You know, people forget about all of this, and yet it keeps happening. And people say, well, you know, politicians fly a lot. You know, that plane crash is a little disproportionate to the rest of the population. How about business travelers? You want to talk about people flying a lot. It seems to be one of the hazards of the job that congressmen and senators seem to die in plane crashes when they're about to make some of the biggest changes that the country needs. So, having said it, there's always risk involved, I suppose, in public service. But the questions become is, what risks are we taking as citizens? And what risks should we take? I mean, at least we should have our voices heard. At least we should speak out. At least we should participate in the activist organizations that we believe in, as long as they're functioning on reasonable, value-based approaches. I mean, violence isn't the answer, certainly not the answer right now. That's the excuse the government needs to finally shut down what little is left of our personal liberty. Let's not give them that, but let's stay in the fight, and let's see what we can do together. Maybe we can, I believe we can, continue to make a difference as we actualize our own potentials and engage the fight from the standpoint of change.